Startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Kastner.
And I'm Caitlin Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by mug.news. This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast. Ecosystem building is the subset of economic development that focuses on fostering entrepreneurial activity within a community. Today's guest is Matt Menietti from St. Louis. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So jumping right in, how did you first become involved in your startup community?
I have to go back a couple of years. So I was hired on as the director of operations for one of the first tech accelerators in town called Capital Innovators. So very quickly, I was thrown into the deep end and started planning pitch days for the accelerator, recruiting companies. And then shortly after that, I learned about some local efforts to get Startup Weekend going in St. Louis. And so I was really excited to be part of that committee and to recruit, entrepreneurs and developers and just people interested in, coming up with their own ideas. So that was, one of the first kind of community things outside of my job that I got involved with. And I was on kind of as in a leadership role with Startup Weekend for a number of years. And that was a lot of fun bringing people together. We had some great events.
Now, were you born in the St. Louis area? Have you lived here your whole life?
No, so I'm actually a transplant from Iowa City, Iowa. So I grew up, that's my hometown. I went to college there and then moved down to St. Louis in 2009 for an AmeriCorps position.
Oh, very nice. And so was it because of the community that you found and getting involved with your first few startups that, drew you to St. Louis and kept you there?
I think that's part of it. I think, prior to getting involved in the tech ecosystem here, I met a lot of people in the nonprofit space, just young people who were, working for local nonprofits, government organizations, political candidates. I just saw that there was a lot of energy around wanting to, realizing that the city is great and we have a lot of things to be thankful and celebratory around. And yet we still have a lot of things that we need to fix, social injustice, inequality. There's just a lot going on in St. Louis and its rich history in that space. And so I was, I think, in many ways, encouraged and excited by others around hey, this is an opportunity for you to have a seat at the table. I think a lot of people in St. Louis kind of feel like it's a town where you have to know people to get connected and it's where you went to high school and all of that. I did not have that experience. I found it to be very welcoming. A number of people that were really great at just making me feel included and wanting me to have a seat at that table and to get involved. So I think my experience in the startup and the tech space mirrored that experience because people were like, hey, this hasn't been built yet. Help us do that. And so I think that's a thing that keeps me here. It's sticky in a good way.
Right. Well, St. Louis is a fantastic area, a lot of culture and food, and I'm a huge fan of the area. So my question then for you is, you'd mentioned how open and welcoming the community was there. Do you think that has anything to do with kind of the Midwestern culture that is surrounded there, or do you think it's area specific? Where's your thoughts on that?
I'll say this is just my experience, so it may not be the same for others. And I think that, just generally, I think my experience in the ecosystem has been that it tends to be people that are, wanting to see things done differently. And so I think in that, there's always people that are kind of willing to be able to express an interest in getting involved and kind of fitting them into whether it's a volunteer role, whether that's hopping on a podcast, whether that's just, designing a poster for Startup Week. I do think the Midwest culture has something to do with it in terms of just being nice to people who are from outside of the region. I wouldn't say that St. Louis is a community or a city that defines itself by that in many ways, like an Austin would, in terms of no one, it's rare that you find someone from Austin. It's a lot of people who are coming from the outside. So I do think there is some tension there in terms of people who have kind of established themselves in St. Louis, whether it's family names, people that have that kind of the gravitas or family history, and then also people who are from outside. But I do think within the entrepreneurship world, it doesn't really matter, what jacket you're wearing, if that analogy makes any sort of sense, or where you're coming from. It's like, if you have cool ideas, if you're an interesting person, if you're generally nice, like, I think that seems to be more of a difference maker in terms of a resume versus like where you went to college, where you went to high school, all that sort of stuff. So that is nice. That's unique, I think, about the entrepreneurship community.
I'd completely agree. There's been someone I spoke to, and they'd mentioned how, yes, they have their resume, but they actually, working in entrepreneurship, they haven't used that resume in so long because of just making those connections and finding another person to work with, another startup to work for. So I've also found that that's a very interesting bridge based on like just business versus entrepreneurship as well. So depending on which route you take. So previously you mentioned working about St. Louis's diversity. So I wanted to ask you then, how do you include diversity, equity, and inclusion when community building in your area?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's been a lot of focus on that recently. I think that the police killing of George Floyd was a huge, I think, inflection point, I think, for a lot of especially organizations to kind of reflect on their own practices and what they were doing. I do think a lot of them were compelled to make statements around just sort of like, hey, we stand against racism and social, this is what we're doing. And it'd be interesting to kind of go back and kind of see, hey, this is a statement that you made, like, what have you done? Was that more of a kind of PR move? Was this something that you're actually investing in? And I do think some organizations took it really seriously in terms of kind of looking inward, looking at hiring practices, looking at how their entrepreneurship programs were positioned for minorities and people of color. When they were listing, like putting things like mentor pages together, like, was it reflective of the community? Things like that. So I think that there is a move to kind of think about how, I think a lot of people believe entrepreneurship is a great equalizer, that anybody from any rank can come up with their own idea for a business. But, that meets reality when, certain people don't have the same, number of bats or quality at bats when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to like the number of women and minorities who are given venture capital funding, like at abysmally low numbers. And I think that there are some folks in St. Louis who are not just talking the talk, but they're making the hire, they're making the wire, they're writing the check to see those things, to address those problems head on. In terms of community building, I think it's just making sure that voices are heard. It's when I step into a room or I'm facilitating a meeting, like understanding that like my presence as a white man, how that comes off, and whether it's like standing up for someone else to be like, who has a great idea, who maybe is less likely to speak up or talk. That's just something I try to do generally. But I do think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There has been a group locally called the St. Louis Equity and Entrepreneurship Collective that was stood up several years ago, that was really around like bringing those service and support organizations together to start thinking about best practices, to start thinking about just data, and understanding like we don't have a good barometer for like how many entrepreneurs of color, how many funders of color do we have in the region, to know that like, are all the activities and the things that we're putting in, all these inputs, actually making a difference? Are we seeing more checks being written to minority founders? So I do think that we have some good starts. We have organizations like the Balsa Foundation, who is giving, kind of micro funding. They gave out $1,000 checks to like, really, really early stage entrepreneurs, but they've also built a community there that I think is really impressive. BioSTL is doing some great diversity work. So we're starting to see people take it more seriously, but I do think it's going to take, additional philanthropic capital, and just people being willing to kind of drop their egos for a little bit and to say like, hey, we screwed up, we're doing this wrong, we need to invest in this. Cortex, which is one of our larger innovation districts, just hired like a chief, like kind of a VP of, equitable economic development, a good friend of mine, Natalie. So I'm excited to see what she does in her role in that, in terms of like really, I think being that voice when it comes to like economic development and kind of building in communities and saying like, hey, what's the impact here? Like, how can we build relationships in the community? How can we make sure that the things that we assume will be good for them may not be? Have we asked them? Have we developed a dialogue and a relationship and trust? So yeah, those are things kind of both at the macro, but also micro level that we're trying to do. So I'd say, it's a wait and see, but we've got, I think, the right people in the right places now to actually make a difference.
So you touched on funding a couple businesses that you had mentioned. So then leading off that, my other question was, do you know of any local grants or interest-free loans for just beginning business starters in your area?
Yeah, so I think that the ones that I mentioned, Balsa, Arch Grants too, I think that they've, been pretty intentional about, when I see new classes come through. So Arch Grants, they give $50,000 in equity-free cash away. I believe they're up to 20, now maybe 25 companies or founders per year with their recent geospatial announcement. I also forgot to mention WePower is another organization here that has gotten has gotten a lot of traction here locally. I know that they partnered with Kiva and some other organizations to provide financing options because, not everybody is interested in going the venture capital route. I think there's a lot of attention that's brought into like, we need more, VCs to write checks to underrepresented founders. And I think that's part of the equation. But I also think that looking at entrepreneurs who want to bootstrap, particularly those who are in the kind of service or manufactured product space, who say like, hey, I don't want to grow super fast and I don't want to have potentially like a really toxic relationship with a venture capital firm that might be on the coast that like doesn't know me, doesn't know my community, doesn't know my history. And they just want to build something of their own. And I think that there's a lot of companies, even software companies locally, that are looking to kind of break that traditional VC model, which I think is healthy. So the grant programs, SBA loans, Kiva through WePower, Arch Grants, Balsa Foundation, a lot of the local accelerators. UMSL has a diversity and inclusion accelerator that they put together with, they do provide money. The regional chamber now, Greater St. Louis Inc. has a diverse business accelerator where it's more about mentoring, community building. I don't think they give out cash at this time. So there are resources available. I can't sit here and say like, hey, is that sufficient? Is it moving the needle in a kind of macro way? But we've got some good, I think it's important to recognize that that's a good start and we could use a lot more help.
It's really cool that you'd mentioned that VCs are working on restructuring instead of being this kind of almost intimidating power to kind of go and request funding from. So it's interesting to see how that's shifting. So then my other question was, what are some things that people wouldn't know about the St. Louis ecosystem? It mentioned that they're restructuring. What's another thing that they wouldn't know?
I think that right now we're still, I think, in many respects, still kind of a startup ecosystem that's on the rise, but also very young. I wouldn't say that we're as mature as some of the other cities like a Boulder or even a Boston. And I think there's opportunity, like there's excitement in that, that we have a chance to really define ourselves and make ourselves unique, just like any entrepreneur or business would, and thinking about what is our like competitive advantage. And I think that you layer on kind of some of the branding efforts with the region and thinking about what makes St. Louis unique. And I think for a long time, so much of what was put out was like, it's a cheap place to live and we've got great amenities for your family. And that message, I think it leaves something to be, I think that it only goes so far, right? Like, I think St. Louis is a great place to raise a family. I think those amenities are unique. I think that from a lifestyle perspective, having an amazing zoo, an amazing botanical garden, our arts programs are top notch. I think our food and restaurant scene, like it hits, we definitely hit above our weight class when it comes to that. But there's plenty of other cities that can also make that argument. I think saying that we're a cheap place to live, like if you're trying to convince an entrepreneur who's maybe like built a company they're going to school in Peoria or Chicago or even Des Moines, how do you convince them that St. Louis is a place for them to not just grow their company, but like also grow their life. And I think that's where things like certainly the proximity to some of our local universities is a big draw. I think whether it's St. Louis University, Washington University, Harris Stowe, that I think access to those universities, that talent, the research opportunities, the tech transfer is huge. I also think the kind of geospatial and the ag focus are some things that are going to make us unique. I think with the announcement of the NGA, really, putting a strong presence here in St. Louis, and with just so much we have the Danforth Plant Science Center. So I do think there's some verticals that I think are starting to establish, ag tech, fintech, geospatial technology that I think make us unique, and will leave a lot of the consumer tech or consumer packaged goods and things like that to maybe some other communities. And I think that's okay. It's okay in the same way that companies can't, be everything to all people. We can say, hey, if you're an entrepreneur in these spaces, it's not to say an entrepreneur that wants to start a civ tech company couldn't get their start here, but are they going to grow to maturity? Are there people that will understand the technology and understand the space? Maybe, but maybe it's not something that we want, quote unquote, want to center and focus resources around. Other things that make us unique. I just think we have incredible entrepreneurs, and I think a lot of cities will say that, but I think a lot of them are not just people who are really great at execution and brilliant thinkers, and we have serial entrepreneurs, but people who genuinely want to give back. And so when I reach out to them, I know they're incredibly busy building products, building teams, but they're always willing to kind of lend a hand, especially when they're helping other entrepreneurs. They understand how hard it is to go off on your own, to start something new, to tell your partner, to tell your friends that, hey, I'm going to quit my job, working at this comfortable 9 to 5 at one of the corporations, and I'm going to start something new. They know how intimidating that is, and they want to support and lift other people up. So I do see that as encouraging. So I think the culture here is strong. And I think, the future is bright for St. Louis entrepreneurship. There's things that we have to work on. I'm hopeful that we can get capacity and money to fund the things that we need. Not just, I was reading about a local ecosystem builder about just sort of like what it takes to really grow innovation communities and districts. And one of them was, prioritize culture as much as you do concrete and the physical infrastructure, which is important. I don't want to but I think the programming, the connections, the culture, and I think it's those things are a lot softer. It's like harder to see. So it's like also harder for people who are writing the checks to kind of see progress. Like they can see buildings go up and say, we did it, we're doing economic development. But when it comes to like building connections, whether it's happy hours, whether it's, events, whether it's just one-on-one coffees and gathering space, I think that's kind of a next iteration for us, as there has been we have seen a lot of construction. We have seen a lot of maker space, co-working space, lab space, gathering and event space. But especially in a post-COVID world, or like say post-COVID, but like in a pandemic world, we're really having to rethink those gathering spaces and their purpose and how we build community, in this new normal.
Mm-hmm.
So we touched on a lot there. So
no, I mean,
going on.
No, you sparked a lot of questions. Like, so one of my other follow-up questions to that, you'd mentioned like interaction and building relationships that way. Do you know of any co-working spaces in the area that you recommend?
Yeah, there's a ton. I've worked in co-working basically my entire career. So I worked out of T-Rex, which is one of the kind of OG, one of the original co-working spaces in downtown St. Louis. Have a lot of respect for what they've built there and just kind of like getting it started. And a lot of the funders, right? Economic development groups that said, we're trying to bring people into downtown. Co-working was just starting to I think really get hot when T-Rex was around. We were some of the first tenants back in 2010, 2011. The accelerator was located there. I remember just grabbing like whiteboards and desks and things, because it was an old Macy's office. So it was kind of this like ghost town of like corporate America, that we were piecing it together to like start companies and help companies. So I think what they've done downtown is really great, and excited to see their future. The guys over in the community at Tech Artista, formerly Covo, well, they kind of merged with Covo. I think that they've done an incredible job of, particularly on the community building side, like really making you feel welcome, really making you feel connected to other people, whether it's just like they have these potluck lunches and come together, we'll play board games. They have happy hours, every Wednesday. So like come down at 4. So it's a place in which you feel like, yes, I have my own individual space to do my work, but it's also like, I think part of the value that co-working brings is that like entrepreneurship can be really lonely. And when you have a tough day, it's like sometimes hard to talk to a loved one, to a partner, to a friend who may not understand what you're going through. It's tough to talk to just other people because there is no one in your office. It may just be you starting a company. So it's like really great to celebrate those wins, or to just like kick stuff around to be like, hey, can you take a look at my website? Can you give me feedback on my sales or my pitch deck? And so I think that they're doing great work. The folks at Cortex and 4240 and CET, I think, are doing a great job just from a facility management perspective. Just really beautiful space, great event space and gathering space. So there's just a lot going on. It'll be interesting to kind of see how I think co-working positions itself now that I think a lot of offices are becoming hybrid. That's like our experience at Conflux and Go Brand Go, and thinking about how people, they want and crave that interaction with teams, but they also like have stuff they need to do at home, and they have kids and they have errands and other things. And at the same time, it's sort of like, I think it'll be a culture shift for many of those companies to like actually, measure people by like output and work versus like, butts and seats and time in the office. And I think companies that are making that shift are going to see an influx of talent to say like, hey, if I have an option between this and this, like I'm going to go to something more flexible. And I think co-working, particularly around like entrepreneurs, or even people who are just like, even people that do work in those more traditional offices, maybe they work for a law firm or a marketing firm, and they've been given freedom to kind of work wherever they want. I think co-working will be an attractive option for them to say like, I might not go in full time, but like on certain days I'm going to go in because there's community and I have an office and I can, get out of my house where like I have laundry and screaming kids and whatever it is. So I do think that they're going to be well positioned. I've talked to a number of them who do seem hopeful. I think more than hopeful, like they're starting to see people come back. I think with the CDC announcement around vaccinations and masking and things like that. And I know that some of that's kind of changing with the Delta variant conversation, but I do think I think co-working is going to come back stronger than it was pre-pandemic. That's just my gut.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I'm definitely just, waiting in my boots. Can't wait to go back into a co-working space and connect more with others in person and face to face. So speaking of kind of community building and connecting, I know co-working spaces are a place where you can go to see what are some upcoming events. But in your experience, what are some other ways that first business starters who just moved to your community, where should they look to find a new, connecting place and events?
I think Venture Cafe has done a great job of like positioning themselves, like certainly like, in the pandemic world, like, so Venture Cafe is a weekly gathering of, innovators, thinkers, entrepreneurs, and they would meet up in the Cortex Innovation District every Thursday afternoon. And there would be just general networking. There'd be some light programming, speakers and things like that. So they'd get a lot of people in, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of people that would go in, and just ton of energy there. Right. Now with COVID and the pandemic, like they haven't been able to gather in person. So they've been doing a lot of, clubhouse, style conversations where it's just like, come, pitch your idea, get feedback sort of thing. So I think part of the benefit too in the pivot is just around like making it feel more intimate. I think one of the things that I struggle with in some of those, not just with Venture Cafe, but other large organizations or events or conferences, is that like, if I'm someone who's looking to build connections and I've got to wade through like 1,000 people, like how do I do that efficiently? And if I'm someone who's new to the community, like how am I welcomed and kind of Sherpa'd along to kind of allow me to make those connections versus like, I know it's really intimidating for me to step into a room. Like I don't mind talking to people. I like conversations. I like talking, with you and talking ecosystem all day. But it can be intimidating just going into like a room where you don't know anybody and like having a business card and making a pitch. So I think that they've been really good about, using technology to facilitate those connections. And for a lot of people that like, they can't make it down on Thursday, whether it's prohibited from, if they don't have a car, if they don't have transportation, if they have childcare to think about. So it's like, I can hop on Clubhouse or whatever platform that they're using, make a pitch, build connections there. So I think some of this, like some of the virtual connectivity, it can't replace in person. Like I do think that both of them are necessary to build community. But I think that they're doing a really great job in terms of like finding ways to get involved. There are other I think kind of outside of that, I think they're kind of the primary one from a community builder, like getting involved. There's one called, I don't know if it's still active during COVID, but House of Genius, which is also a feedback mechanism that is run locally. So the way that it runs, I think it's like every month they bring in 2 or 3 entrepreneurs that have a specific problem or a prompt. They might say like, hey, this is my established business. I'm thinking about like going into this market. Like, what do you think? Or what do you think about our pricing strategy? And they go in and they don't know any of the people that are giving them feedback. These are mentors. These are people from the community that are there to provide constructive criticism. And I think a lot of times it's, going back to the culture question about like Midwest nice. I think the drawback of that is you get people who will say, Caitlin, that's a great idea for a company, go with it. And then internally, like, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard and it's going to fail. So there's this need, I think, to then be nice. And especially someone who's starting something new, it's like, we don't have a mechanism for giving people that harsh criticism or telling them their baby is ugly, but also taking care of them at the same time. It's like it's just hard to get feedback. But I think House of Genius packages that in such a way that the entrepreneur knows they're being supported and they know what they're walking into. And sometimes it does seem harsh, but sometimes they're getting feedback that they may not have been given, especially if they're talking to like a loved one, a parent, a friend who is like, I don't want to hurt their feelings. They're going to this environment knowing that their idea is going to get picked apart, that they're going to get constructive criticism, and they're coming out of that, steel sharpens steel. They're coming out of that stronger, and they have an opportunity then to network with those people who are giving feedback and mentoring them afterwards. And it's all like very chummy, and they're like, oh, Matt, you asked a really tough question. Like, I really appreciate that. So it's not just like, it's like me like digging on an entrepreneur and then like leaving afterwards. It's like, hey, this is where I'm coming from. This is why I gave you that feedback. And I think it's been really productive for both the community members to like meet new and interesting companies, but also especially for the entrepreneur who is just getting like sometimes very raw, but like very direct and very helpful feedback in a way that they may not get in another setting.
No, that sounds completely, I like the contrary that you've said to that, is that, it's very good to have the Midwest nice, but you really stress the importance of, you really need some truthful feedback to make sure that everything is going smoothly. Otherwise, it's much harder to grow with certain flaws that aren't being pointed out in your business. So it's very interesting that you can see both sides of that. So thank you for sharing a little bit more of your opinion on that. Because I agree. So then one of my other questions for you then, as we're kind of getting to the list, what is your advice for someone who is just at the forefront of starting their business? What is the first thing that you recommend that they do when they're like, I have an idea, where do I go from that?
There's a tendency for those entrepreneurs to, and even if they have trouble, like even calling themselves an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur is a tough word to say. It's a tough word to spell. I'm someone who has an idea. I'm maybe not yet a founder yet. And I think there's a tendency for them to be really measured and calculated with who they talk to, right? I don't want to share this because A, it's hard to hear, it's hard to get feedback. And then B, like, I don't want anybody to steal my idea. And so I think instilling them a sense of, especially in kind of the startup and tech and software space, that very rarely is what you're doing defensible in terms of intellectual property. Like if this is a medical device, if this is, a life science startup, maybe, there's something from a patent perspective that you can protect. But it's all about your execution. It's about your ability to go to market. It's about your ability to like come up with a really great product and get it out into the world. It's about messaging. It's about your ability to build a really strong team that will be what will make a difference versus like, oh, I can't share this idea. And if it's so unique that like no one understands it, well, maybe the market hasn't been established yet. The fact that there are other people that are doing it is a good indicator that maybe there's an opportunity for you to come in and disrupt that. So I think that the advice would be tell as many people as possible. And I think that will, I think that just, it helps address any sort of fear of getting started, is like telling a lot of different people. And it also helps curate your pitch. It sharpens it, it polishes it to say, if I start telling people about what I do at Conflux, like sometimes I modify my speech based on their verbal cues or nonverbal cues. So if they're like, oh yeah, I understand that, you're comparing it to X or Y. So I think that's really helpful. Other things to get started, I think just talk to as many potential customers as possible. I think so many of our entrepreneurs are focused on solutions, and they're like, oh, I have a mock-up for the app, and this is how we're going to roll it out and all this. And it's like, do you actually know what problem you're solving for potential customers? And I think that like being passionate about the problem just as much as a solution. And I see that's a common an error or a misstep in that, like, they're not talking. It's like, how did you get validated? Did you put up a website? Did you get any sort of, was it a landing page? Did you getting interest forms? Are you from this industry? Are you working in manufacturing or healthcare or the pet industry, and you understand the problem intimately because you experienced it? I think those two, and like really doing customer research to be like, how can you make your customer the hero of their own story, and understanding how your app or technology is going to allow them to do things that maybe they haven't done before, whether it's like personal finance, whether it's business software, things like that, and really understanding how your product fits and solves their specific problem, getting really clear on what that is and what their pain point is, because then everything else, not that it will be simple, but like it'll flow from that. You'll really understand the features that you want, the messaging that you'll need to use, what resonates with them. And I think those are the two biggest pieces of feedback and advice that I can get for people who are just starting out.
Well, thank you so much for that. So then my follow-up question then is, are there any news media outlets that you follow, or any podcasts and blogs that are dedicated to ecosystem building for startups in your city?
So I do think that ecosystem building is I think it's a new paradigm for St. Louis. I think that we are focused on more traditional economic development. There's a lot of money going into not just regional branding, which I think is good. I think that there are limitations to that. We are putting a lot of resources behind that. So I think if the outcome is like talent and tourism that's coming here, that's great. But I want to see what's that ROI, right? If we're spending on ads and billboards and all this sort of stuff, like it's very difficult to like tie that to economic outcomes that are beneficial for St. Louis. I do think there's a lot of money that's being put toward recruiting companies and recruiting businesses here, right? We have within our economic development agency, we have a team that's devoted to that. And again, while I do think that's important, I think that especially in this kind of pandemic and COVID world where people are really rethinking offices and commercial real estate, it puts a giant question mark up to be like, hey, for instance, like here, like there was a story recently about how Square, it was built by Jim McKelvey, Jack Dorsey, both that have local ties to St. Louis. Square is they're not headquartered in St. Louis. Like we didn't have the talent infrastructure that they needed, the talent pool or base. And so that's why it's on the coast. And but there is a downtown office, and it will hold, I think, the number referenced like over 1,000 people. But with COVID, it's like they have a lot of this, large tech companies have flexible work policies. So if the intention was to get a lot of people downtown, how many people out of that 1,200 are actually going to be downtown, living downtown, eating and experiencing concerts and restaurants downtown? I don't know that. So then we've invested all this time to kind of bring a company like Square, and they're just one example, right? There were, I think unique things about that story that I don't want to make this like the true example, but that's a good example of just like when we're recruiting, when we're stealing, borrowing companies from others or recruiting them to say like, hey, we want your footprint here. We want your workers. How does that conversation change with COVID? And what would it look like if we were to take that kind of pool of resources and instead of putting it toward recruiting companies here, it's how can we home grow? And I think that's just I wouldn't say that culture has been fully adopted among our economic development agencies. I think it's part of, but I don't think it's given sufficient. It kind of feels like sometimes that entrepreneurship is sitting at the kids' table when like the real economic developments are folks are talking here, entrepreneurship. So I think that that would be really important. So I'm sorry, what was your original question? I feel like I got a little bit off track.
No, a completely good advice. But it was any news outlets that you subscribe to.
Outlets.
Or podcasts that you listen to.
Podcasts. So we're talking about ecosystem building, but in terms of news, I think one of the challenges has been that though I think more traditional outlets have not covered as many stories about entrepreneurship. I think when it comes to funding, when it comes to exits, those types of things typically get a nice write-up, new accelerator classes, things like that. I do think more stories that are centered around like the individual people. I think we have really interesting stories about entrepreneurs that are not tied to like, Somersault. Somersault is an incredible St. Louis story. Women's fashion, swimwear, travel wear, homegrown in St. Louis. Like people, like my wife and I went to the pool to watch our niece and nephew the other day. Like saw like 2 or 3 Somersault swimsuits, right? Like it's taking not just St. Louis by storm, but hopefully the world by storm. This great fashion and clothing company here in St. Louis. And there's been a lot of, I think, write-ups nationally, but in terms of St. Louis, it's like they'll talk about funding rounds and certain things, but the founders, Lori and Reshma, like have done an incredible job, like really building a relationship and a team and a culture that I think, are world-class. And I would love to see more stories, but particularly about women, about minorities, about just sort of the challenges and opportunities for them, and that it's not always just tied to like VC funding. So I think, locally we have a publication called EQ that I think saw that problem and started, putting out stories. I think that they've been through a couple of different iterations in terms of leadership, in terms of format, that I think we need more consistency, I think, with publications like that to kind of get more stories out, more interviews, more podcasts. I think that the guys at Slam have been doing this podcast with in partnership with venture cafe called Innovation City. They do more like human interest stories, and not just entrepreneurs, just like interesting people who have cool ideas and have something to say. So I do think there's a huge opportunity for a lot of that local storytelling to be done. I do think that one of the local publications, the Business Journal, is starting to change their structure a little bit so that they can do more of that intentional storytelling, maybe be doing events and things around that, because they do see a huge opportunity. And again, reporting on construction and hires at local law firms, like it's fine, but like the entrepreneurship is exciting, it's hot, it's sexy, and there's a lot of content to be mined there. But I think that we need more, the consistent message of just like, yes, it's great, and we need more of that. We need more people telling stories. We need more people getting out there, blogging, podcasting, whatever it is, generating content, because I think that helps others who may be sitting at a local corporation at a 9-to-5, who have aspirations to leave their company and do something really amazing and build a product or build a company or whatever it is that they want to do, maybe just a side business. And they hear about that on a podcast. They hear about it in their local paper. They hear about it from St. Louis Public Radio, and then they're inspired. They want there's if you see a lot of people doing it, then you're given, I think, some space to experiment and to try to say like, St. Louis is a place for me. And I think as a culture, one of the things that I think draws us back a little bit is that it is one where we are not, what happens when people fail? It's like, are we a culture in that incentivizes failure? How do we look upon people who try something big and fail? And I would say we're ones that are kind of like, we like sure bets and we want people to show me. Like there's not a lot, like, I think a culture of risk taking is something that's an opportunity for growth for our community, and not just amongst entrepreneurship. I think entrepreneurship can be I think they need to be a part of that conversation, because it's all about taking risk and doing something that's a little bit nuts and crazy. And I think that's a Midwest thing too, in general, just like a community that if someone tries and fails, that like so much of what they're remembered for is the failure, versus like, wow, that person like took a big swing. They pointed toward the stands and said, I'm going to hit a home run. And for whatever reason, it failed. So I think just a human approach and being more accepting of people who have taken those big swings, that have crazy ideas. And then for funders, for people to come along and understand, like, big returns require big risk. And for them to say like, hey, we know this maybe hasn't been done before. And instead of kind of like doing incremental things and doing like, well, we have to kind of see what the market looks like and fund some of your partners and competitive. No, it's like, let's put some real dollars behind this and do some. And again, it's not my money, so I can sit here and say, take more risk. But I think that will come with more entrepreneurs who do exit and that do have financial success, that do have an opportunity to kind of be more flexible and to be less risk averse with their capital, who say like, I've already made it, and now I have my monopoly, my play money that I can use to invest back in the ecosystem. I don't think we've hit that inflection point yet, that we have had that kind of household exit where their leadership teams, their employees do get financial return and can invest, whether it's in real estate, whether it's more startups. Because I think, because just inherent in the people that are attracted to startups, like I think they're going to be more tolerant of that risk and can start investing either in their second or third company that they want to start, or in others ideas. And I think that's just a natural evolution. That's just our ecosystem going from infant to teenager to, whatever growth analogy you want to use.
Well, thank you so much for all of your insight and perspective with entrepreneurship and ecosystem building. But before we completely close out, I wanted to ask, do you have any final thoughts before we part ways?
No, it's a subject that I'm really passionate about. I'm an engineer by trade. I'm a systems thinker, but I'm also someone who loves building new relationships. And I found that the people that I meet in the ecosystem, whether they're founders or whether they're people that want to help them, are like some of the most like genuine, kind, interesting people I've ever met. And I think that, St. Louis has a lot of great individuals. And I think part of the struggle that I find is like, sometimes like the work that we do is sometimes just overlooked. And I think ecosystem building is incredibly important. And I'm really thankful for people like you who are giving voice to that, who are like trying to, establish this industry and this, just sort of trade and kind of informal title. Like there are people that do ecosystem building for a living, and I'm very jealous of them. And just some people who kind of wear that mantra as a community leader, whether that be a founder, a funder, a mentor, or other. And so I'm very hopeful that more cities recognize the need and importance for ecosystem building as a critical piece for their economic development strategy. Like, how do we help more entrepreneurs get from point A to point B? And I think ecosystem building helps solve that problem. Thinking about how do you structure resources and community in such a way that people kind of flow from one stage to the next. And then if they fail, they can get recycled and start it all over, right? We want to see people try new and different things, even though, sometimes there is failure, and we have to be comfortable with that.
Absolutely. And raising everyone up in the process. And I think that's a great note to, close out on. And so, yeah, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been wonderful to have you, and a huge thank you from mug.news.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Now that we've learned about an ecosystem from a person who's building it, I'm going to link back up with Nick to clarify on some jargon and take a deeper dive into this ecosystem.
Caitlin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. What about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. It's we're recording this going into a weekend, and I am looking forward to it. How was your conversation with Matt?
It was wonderful. We got to talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and that is something that I always love to bring onto the podcast. I'm sure you can agree. We've both done really huge highlights with people, and I feel like as we are growing this podcast, as we're growing the Midwest and attention to it, I feel like every episode has some relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the past few episodes. And so I just think that it's really cool to see that progression as we are growing ourselves.
Yes. And I've said this a few times, but there's been a bunch of talk about this over the last 2 years. And it's good to actually see some some actions and people like implementing things, implementing something tangible. That seems like a very big takeaway, Caitlin. Were there any other big takeaways you wanted to highlight?
Oh yeah. So my other official takeaway, I was just so excited to get started, was that Matt mentioned bringing people to the table. And what really stood out to me by that statement, it's like, yes, we talk about opening opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. But what he really touched on that caught my attention was people who wouldn't normally speak up. And so he's like creating a safe space where, if people of color, smaller minorities, not being able to stand up for themselves or being shy or being nervous about it. I just think that it's really important that here he's trying to create an atmosphere where we're encouraging people to voice their opinions. And I just think that was something that stood out to me. It went beyond saying, oh, here's a seat. He was saying, here's how we're helping people use their voice. So I really liked that he mentioned that.
Yes, as every ecosystem builder across the country should be thinking and implementing. Was there anything you had to look up after?
Actually, yeah, this was a fun thing to look up, but he'd mentioned a ton of financial opportunities, financial funding. So I'm just checking out my notes, but he'd mentioned Balsa and We Powers, for example. And so again, and he listed out countless other financial loans and everything. So I just thought that was really cool, and I was like, oh gosh, I'll pick a couple to check out, but both of them very cool.
Yes, yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on, Caitlin?
Yeah, I guess my final thought was, be retrospective of your community. Take a look at what your strengths are, and then also pay attention to where you need more attention. What are the weaknesses that are present? And then don't be embarrassed about those weaknesses. Don't say, oh, we're not good at it, let's not even try. It's okay to look back and see what you need to do to improve, and then go ahead and get people to help you improve it and bring attention to it in your community.
A wonderful, wonderful takeaway, Caitlin. Claps around. And hopefully the next episode, Caitlin and I are going to make something in person. We're going to be together. She's coming to Omaha. We're going to link up and do a in-person ecosystem builder podcast episode. So I cannot wait for that. Stay tuned. And was there anything else you want to highlight, Caitlin, or can I read us out?
Just woohoo. I'm so excited. We again Nick and I have never met in person. We have never been in the same room. So this is such a highlight to come to Omaha and get driving and kind of post-ish COVID. So again, I'm so excited to see you, Nick, and that's all I have. So if you want to go ahead and read us out.
Yes, and I love a good woohoo. That was a good woohoo placement. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ecosystem Builder Podcast, which is a product of mug.news and hosted by myself, Nick Kastner, and my wonderful co-host, Caitlin Clays. If you have any questions about today's episode, connect with us on Twitter at Nick Kastner, at Clays Creates, or at Mug News Official. If you enjoyed this episode, please drop a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps support the show, and also share the link with your friends or fellow ecosystem builders. We release episodes every single Wednesday morning, so make sure to tap that follow button so you don't miss a beat.
See you next time.